So that said, our session today brings into action the subject of an article co-written by David and Maggie, currently under review for the special issue of Feminist Formations, Time, Urgency, and Collaboration in the Corporate University. Their research examines how resistance toward capitalism's temporal bullying is performed in contemporary art and activism. The piece addresses the relationship between creativity, institutions, and empowerment, and explores aesthetic presentations of resistive temporalities they identify as non-production. The case studies of non-production offered affirm a performance of resistance that centers discussion of radicality in interdependent care networks available to all disabled and non-disabled individuals. It highlights a care ethic that claps back at the idea of self-optimization and fiduciary endurance amidst economic regimes of exploitation. In place of the culture industry of wellness, their work boosts new directions in care and mutual aid as premised on queer, crip, and feminist portrayals of disability praxis and social justice pedagogy. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Maggie and David, who will tell us more about that.
Thank you, Angina. All right, so the corporatization of the university has quickened the pace of life in academia, a trend of hyper-acceleration and expectation of production. This exists and continues to exist in tandem with the social and temporal shifts brought about by the pandemic, especially last year when a large percentage of the world transitioned from in-person to remote in a matter of days. Disability advocates and scholars describe this as an event that universalized crip time. In their introduction to the South Atlantic Quarterly special issue, Crip Temporalities, Ellen Samuels and Elizabeth Freeman write, quote, "With the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, suddenly US academics and other white-collar workers who had previously resided in the sheltered space of the norm were thrust into the time-consuming, often frustrating space of crip time. They found themselves grappling with Zoom and other video chat technologies, struggling to balance the exigencies of groceries and childcare with expectations of professional performance, running out of hours in the day and energy in their body minds to keep up. They remarked on social media that it was taking much longer to do anything. They remarked on social media that it was taking much longer to get anything accomplished, that they could not focus, that unstructured days indoors were strangely tiring, that instructional technologies themselves produce strange effects on their energy and motivation. In the time of COVID-19, those who had lived previously with the privilege of normative ability began to learn what sick and disabled people have known forever. That crip time isn't easy, it isn't fair, it cannot be reasoned with. Many of us continue to experience the compounded difficulties of capitalistic time, contending with a loss of time, or with the absence of sufficient time to grieve, to heal, to rest, and so on. This is a collective conversation, and some of, I just grabbed a few screenshots from Twitter from this week, which sort of underscores that this is a collective experience. So capitalism has two speeds, hungry and overbooked. I need a month or 2 or 3 off. Am I lazy, or am I breaking my capitalist addiction to productivity? Everyone is dealing with exhaustion and unable to concentrate on basic tasks, right? Yes, everyone's traumatized. Half the country is violently angry about shit that doesn't exist. And the other half is completely burned out, exhausted due to the first half. This year, I'm taking part in November, pronounced November, where I will be saying no to everything, go away. And our very own Wiggy Marine is also reinforcing this idea of non-production in her tweet. In my writing group, we are celebrating November. I'm kicking it off by saying no to anything that could cut into my enjoyment of the WIGS conference. I'm going to be just as present for this virtual conference as I would be for an in-person one. And we want to be clear about what this session is not. This is not yet another wellness seminar that is offered to you in response to our unmanageable workloads. But let's talk about what it is. So for today's Feminism in Action session, we have no end goal, so to speak, but rather want to create space and time to learn from and share with each other and generate productive, helpful conversation on the topics of the politics of care, non-production, and crip time. This is a large conversation that we merely want to begin here. And hopefully we can take our reflections and ideas with us throughout the conference, as well as beyond to our various communities.
So let's begin by exploring a few terms. Crip. The term crip is short for cripple, traditionally an offensive or pejorative designation for a person who is disabled. It has been reclaimed by the disabled community as a positive, sassy, and profound identifier. In her blog post, Crip, A Story of Reclamation, Alice Kirby notes, reclamation is not a new phenomenon. It's common amongst marginalized and oppressed groups, many which take ownership of the words they reclaim. This means they cannot be used by outsiders. They belong to us and they empower us. Most disabled people who identify as Crips use disability first language, as opposed to person first language. We prefer to be called disabled people rather than people with disabilities. Crip time. Crip time is shaped by dependency. Alison Kafer explains crip time in her book, Feminist, Queer, Crip, as follows, quote, crip time is flex time, not just expanded, but exploded. It requires reimagining our notions of what can and should happen in time, or recognizing how expectations of how long things take are based on very particular minds and bodies. Rather than bend disabled bodies and minds to meet the clock, crip time bends the clock to meet disabled bodies and minds. Samuels and Freeman talk about crip time, quote, as paradoxically both liberating and confining, because it breaks open rigid socioeconomic structures of time and affords others an enforcement issued by the physical and mental structures of the crip body mind. Even as crip time is a space of frustration and often loss, it is also a space that offers new kinds of connections and presence that are fundamental to imagining a new world into beginning. To articulate crip time requires expression of subjectivity. My own crip time, for example, is monotonous and compacted, dizzying and expansive. It's a time to myself, often isolated to a room in which I sleep, study, eat, produce, and communicate. It is rural, desolate, and digital. It's a space open to potential through the present moment of uncertainty and the interconnective technologies of scholarship. But it's also a time apart from the institutions of power, knowledge, and authority that make disciplinarity in the humanities, and in my case, history, possible. It's a freedom granted by the contingencies of academic work in the age of COVID-19, but a freedom that risks nearly everything, as access is granted by a body of colleagues based on pre-existing ableist rubrics of merit, prestige, and erudition, all of which are increasingly hazardous to my own body-mind as a disabled person living with epilepsy and neurocognitive disorders. The activities suggested to us by our institutions to combat capitalism's debilitating effects are severely unimaginative. We are encouraged to integrate simple measures like taking breaks, slowing down, and resting. Moreover, the commodification of self-care now is presented as part of a bundle of semi-voluntary and semi-compulsory endeavors in fiduciary endurance. An argument which insists all individuals, regardless of material circumstances, remain, quote, in this together. This directive to take care of one another's self for the sake of mind, body, and polity places the onus of responsibility on the individual worker as citizen, in addition to the individual worker as consumer. Even with recent mass worker strikes in the United States, led against public university systems like the University of California, and global corporations like Amazon and John Deere, employees' demands are centered not so much on radical transformation, but rather supplemental benefits and wage increases. The cultural critic and philosopher Mark Fisher identifies this inability to envision a decisive ideological shift distinct from neoliberal economic output as, quote, capitalist realism. With the rise of the global corporate economy after 1991, it is now, according to Fisher, quote, simply obvious that everything in society, including healthcare and education, should be run as a business. Following this claim, many workers today are unable to picture rest free from their relationships with parasitic employers and impersonal oligopic megacorporations. For this reason, non-production and resistive temporalities take unique shape in creative ways between liberatory imagination and resistance to toxic work culture.
These debilitating effects of capitalism, along with the compounded trauma brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic, have together produced an entry point for non-disabled folks to understand temporalities that shape disabled individuals' everyday experience. Again, an event that universalized crip time. British public intellectual and novelist Arundhati Roy writes about how the pandemic holds the potential to provide a portal to new futures. African-American performance artist and activist Tricia Hersey integrates white supremacy, grind culture, and the commodification of rest in her nap ministry project, proclaiming that, quote, our bodies are a site of liberation. There is also Fanny Souza and Navid Acosta's Black Power Naps, a sculptural installation and curatorial initiative that reclaims laziness and idleness as power. Other specifically crip aesthetics of temporal resistance include the portrayal of misshapen time, visually represented by Amelie Dublin and Konstantina Zavitsona's cripped out reinterpretation of Benjamin Franklin's regimented daily routine, a timetable which perfectly illustrates the early American white propertied slaver, cis male moralism around work and emphasis on independence. Their piece juxtaposes the 18th century white male dominated bourgeois time with that of sick time, illustrating how non-compliant the latter is with the compulsory ableist notion of productivity. Christine Sun Kim is an artist who uses American Sign Language and asks questions in written form using an iPhone on a daily basis. Her visual poem series, 6 Types of Waiting in Berlin, provide a constellation of cultural and sensorial experiences with time. Crip time here is punctuated by the pauses in writing and scrawling questions in reading, and the creativity involved in ad-lib responding between deaf and non-deaf sensorial modalities.
Disabled body minds.
I'm still reading.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
And Jemina Lindholm's visual poem pictures a way of life where debility is no longer refuted, but instead incorporated. So Alison Kafer reminds us that the temporalities of late capitalism center on productivity, capacity, self-sufficiency, independence, and achievement. Crip temporalities, in contrast, write Samuels and Freeman, quote, are neither about speed or slowness, but about new rhythms, new practices of time, new socio-temporal imaginaries. These new practices of pandemic time raise intriguing and important questions for the new world we are making.
Disabled body minds express and operate within their own unique chronologies. And this deviation from any given normative temporality is itself a form of situated knowledge. Disabled body minds simply do not conform to the contours of neoliberalism. To live in a body mind made vulnerable by debility and ableist expectations of health and prosperity is itself a threat to the logic of capacity and productivity. To be sure, when states of debility are understood as forms of knowledge, new possibilities for collective action are recognized. Disability activist and curator Taraneh Fazeli notes, quote, one thing that unites disabled people with those in other fluctuating states of debility is that their bodies are simply not as valuable to capitalism. Solidarity in the face of unending demand for economic output is the very thing that makes crip futures possible. Samuels and Freeman ask, quote, what if we developed new forms of punctuality centering on presence, simultaneity, and concurrence, new ways of being together in time, perhaps even ones that value stasis and the present rather than motion and the future? What if temporal rhythms and the attached notions of normalcy, productivity, and community were forever cripped, detached from chrononormative capitalist structures, and predicated instead on the myriad realities of the body minds along a spectrum of abilities? Crip timescales we all create and share together.
Thank you, Maggie and David. We are now going to continue by taking what we have heard from Maggie and David into discussion groups. For those who joined us late, there is a link in the chat that takes you to the script of the talk, as well as the discussion questions, but we will also post the discussion questions in the chat for you to have handy. We'll now break into small groups to discuss some of our own experiences with time regimented controls imposed on us by our institutions, society, and so on, alongside the ideas around liberation and solidarity presented here. Before we get to the questions, however, let's quickly review the structured conversation guide shared by Claire Scott. We will make space for everyone. In order to ensure all voices are heard, be concise in your sharing. Everyone should have an opportunity to talk. Our listening will be meaningful. Speak with the promise of being heard, and listen with the possibility of being changed. Be willing also to experience discomfort. What is said here stays here. What is learned here leaves here.